Snow fell softly enough to hide its own sound. From my kitchen window, the yard looked like paper left out for a child, a clean page begging for the first mark. The fence wore a smooth white ridge, the maple's limbs were icing on black fingers, and my breath clouded the glass. The radiator clicked behind me like a metronome, keeping time with the storm. I pressed my palm to the window. The pain felt numb, and the heat of my skin flashed back at me in a fogged oval that slowly cleared. I poured tea. The steam smelled like the lemon slice I had squeezed with my fingers. The citrus burned my cuticle where a paper edge had nicked me earlier. I set the cup on the sill and stayed there long enough for the tea to cool on top. It felt like any other winter night after a long day. I watched, because that is what you do when you live alone and the town tucks itself in early. Watching is a way to keep company with yourselves. The yard was blank, and then it was not. Without footprints, without anyone crossing the fence or the porch or the garden, a perfect snow angel opened in the center of the lawn. Arms splayed in a crescent, legs set apart just enough, the imprint of shoulders and a shallow oval where a head should be. I stared long enough for the top layer of snow to sift into the impression and make it gentler, like a bed that remembers a body. My throat closed. The kettle's leftover steam fogged the glass again, and when it cleared, the angel was still there. The porch motion light did not trip. No shadow crossed the yard. My phone's camera made the same scene look colder and smaller. I captured an image. That image showed only the angel and falling flakes, nothing else. The recording I took in the next breath gave me only the refrigerator's hum and the faint tick of the radiator. The outside held its silence. If anyone had been outside, they did not breathe near the kitchen vent, because I would have heard it when I pressed my ear to the grill. I heard only the heat moving. I unlocked the back door and cracked it. Air slid over my feet and reached under the cuffs of my flannel pants. It smelled like iron and wet wood from the porch rail. I shut the door and relocked it with a careful turn. That is an ordinary habit, a human habit. We repeat it without thinking. The glass reflected my face, the kitchen light above me, and behind the reflection, a figure on the lawn with wings pressed into snow that no one had pressed. I wiped the window with my sleeve, though it did not need wiping. Who lay down in my yard without walking in? I went out at first light, which was more gray than light. The snow squeaked under my boots. The cold burned the inside of my nose. The angel's shape held sharp edges where the wind had not yet rounded them. The yard did not carry a single approach that made sense. Near the left fence, a faint trough ran parallel to the boards, like a rope had been dragged there. I followed it with the toe of my boot, not stepping on the mark itself. The trough was shallow and broke where a drift had slumped. At the far corner, I found prints, one set. The stride was long and careful, toes pointed outward, a little, heel edges firm. The prints came in from the alley and stopped at the fence. On my side, none continued. I looked for the trick. I have made snow angels. You move your arms and legs, and then you stand carefully and step out. Someone had not stood here. Someone had not stepped out at all. I crouched and blew on the snow inside the angel's arm. Grains slid and settled, and under them I saw the suggestion of a woven pattern, like a mesh had bitten into the surface. I did not know then what that implied. Near the gate latch, something orange peeked from the edge of a drift. I picked it up. It was a strip torn from a license tag, the kind hunters fasten to game. It smelled faintly of plastic and the glove I had clutched earlier. There were black bars printed on it and half a letter. It was dry, as if it had spent the night tucked somewhere under cover and only recently found the snow. I pocketed it. I traced the prints back toward the alley. They never overlapped themselves. They curved behind my lilac bushes and kept curving, a wide arc that returned to the alley without crossing its own path. I had the thought, not yet a full thought, that whoever made these prints did not like to cross his own trail. He had placed each foot like a mark he would not step on again. When I reached the alley, a truck had scraped a channel, and the prints ended clean where plow and tire had chewed the snow away in a single pass. If the person had left by the same route, the truck took the evidence. If the person had left some other way, I could not find it. By the bulkhead at the back of my house, the snow had slumped in a way that suggested weight had pressed down and then been lifted. The padlock on the doors wore a cap of ice. I put my bare fingers on it and yanked them away. The metal stung and dampened my skin. The hinge smelled of cold grease. I listened and heard the furnace cycle down through the basement wall. I told myself the house thumped because it was old. I told myself no one could be inside because I had locked the bulkhead myself before the first snow. The angel lay still and perfect, arms slightly raised as though asking. I turned once in a circle in the yard to see who might be watching, only the maple and the roofs and the power lines. On the fence just beyond my yard, a crow landed and made a clean pair of prints, one beside the other, and then flapped away. The crow did not step in its own marks when it left, what walks into a yard and never needs to walk back. That afternoon, the plows stopped and the snow softened. The day held that quiet that comes after a storm when everyone stays inside and lets the town put itself back together. I drank another cup of tea I did not finish and kept my boots on. When I checked the yard again, the angel's edges had blurred under a thin sift of powder shaken from branches. The trough by the fence had become more visible where the wind skimmed a layer away. I followed the trough across the yard. It widened and deepened near the bulkhead doors in a curve that resembled the end of a sled trail. A thread of dark fur or hair clung to the hinge where the wind had warmed the metal a fraction. I pulled it free. It stuck to the pad of my finger and would not let go until I breathed on it. There was a smell then, not strong, a cold animal smell like wet wool left in a shed. The scent came from the hinge and the fiber both. I unlocked the bulkhead and checked that the inner door was latched from the inside as it should be. The latch was down. The inner door did not rattle when I thumped it. I pressed my ear to the wood. The board felt colder than the air. At first I heard nothing but my own blood and the pop of the furnace starting. I stayed longer than comfort wanted me to, and when the furnace cut off, the basement held a quiet so complete I could hear tiny shifts in the joists. Then a tap, one tap. I did not move. Another, softer, as if something thin had reached the wood and fallen away. It came from low, near the seam where the two bulkhead doors met. I counted my breaths to be sure I was not inventing it. On my phone, I recorded the air pressed to the wood. Later, when I played the file, it captured the taps faintly. I did not hear a voice. The recording was small and muffled, baked into its own static. If there had been a voice, the phone would have heard it better than my ear. It did not. I cannot claim more than those taps. I inferred begging because of the taps. I raised my head and felt the draft from the crack. I slipped the padlock back through the hasp and snapped it closed because that is what I do when I am afraid. I keep the outside outside. The bright, sharp sound of the lock engaging made me flinch. My fingers remembered the orange strip in my pocket and warmed around it. When I turned, the trough I had followed looked deeper than before, as if something had been pulled along it more than once. The angel in the yard seemed closer to the bulkhead than the center now that I looked again. I measured with my stride and found that it was several paces nearer the doors than I had thought at dawn. Maybe I had misjudged distance through glass. Maybe the drift had slumped. The rational explanations gathered like friends trying to walk me home. They did not reach the porch with me. The key at my throat knocked the zipper pull on my coat as I stepped inside. The sound was very small. The house held my breath as if it belonged to someone else. Why did the bulkhead answer when I knocked? My neighbor, the one with the camo cap and the yard full of stacked firewood, waved to me from his driveway as I shoveled. He had the snowblower out. It coughed and spat a ribbon of white like chaff. He has always been friendly in the way people are when they have been your neighbor for years and have borrowed your ladder and returned it with the paint rubbed in a new place. He hunts in season. He eats what he kills. He posts pictures of venison roasts when the leaves turn. He smells like cedar chips sometimes, and sometimes like the solvent he uses on his tools. "You see the kids left a mark in your yard," he called. "Bored already?" "No kids," I said. "Not here." He laughed like I had told a joke. "You want me to run this path for you?" He pointed the chute toward my gate and then angled it away before I could answer, as if the offer was just courtesy, a practiced bit of neighbor language. Snow dusted the brim of his cap. His boots were clean in a way that said he had lined his mudroom with newspaper and scraped the treads with a brush, the way hunters do to avoid tracking anything into a place that tells stories back. While he worked, I studied the alley. The plow had carved one pass and left a wall on each side. In the wall, a wedge-shaped bite showed where someone had come out earlier. The prints I had traced rounded and rejoined the alley here, then were erased by the first vehicle through. The arc never crossed itself. My neighbor saw me looking and lifted his chin toward the woods past the last backyard. "Coyotes run the fence line after a storm," he said. "They make funny tracks when they double back, looks like loops." He grinned. "Tricksters." I walked the length of the fence. Every place the snow had a story, my eyes tried to gather it. At my maple, I noticed a thin line stretched through the upper branches, taut as a clothesline, anchored to my gutter bracket and then to the fence post at the alley. It was clear monofilament, the kind you use for fishing or for hanging decorations that should look like they float. It cut a straight path through the soft fall, bead by bead. I followed it with my eyes to the fence and saw where it vanished into a knot of ivy. At dusk, I returned to the angel with a yardstick. I pressed the stick into the snow at the head and felt resistance, not soil but something flat under the handful top layer. When I eased the stick aside and scooped, I exposed a pan-shaped mark on the surface of the snow just beneath, as if a wide plate had met it and been lifted. A memory woke: school fairs with potato stamps, my mother making a print of a leaf by pressing it under paper. I glanced at the line in the maple. The wind tugged it and it quivered. Someone had pressed the angel into my yard without stepping there. They had used a shape to make a shape and then pulled it back along the line. That is when the earlier hint hardened into knowing whoever did this chose not to cross their path. The line arced a route and retreated the way it had come. The person had pulled the tool in, pressed, lifted, and drawn it back, leaving marks that traveled only one way. I looked at my neighbor's upstairs window. A shutter held half closed against the weather. The reflection on the glass gave me nothing. Who arranges a yard like a blind, then sits close enough to admire the print? A girl at the coffee shop had not opened that day. Someone said on the neighborhood site that she was never late. Someone else wrote that her car sat outside her basement apartment with snow icing its hood. People imagined reasons that were not reasons. They typed them and sent them into the winter air, which did not care. By then, I had stopped telling myself this was a prank. The angel returned the second night, a fresh one nested partly over the first, closer to the bulkhead. This time, beneath the stamped oval where a head would rest, the snow dented a tiny bit deeper. When I brushed the spot with my glove, a small round hole appeared, plugged with a twist of birch bark. I pulled the bark free. The hole went down several inches, then bent at an angle and went deeper. I put my face close and breathed out. The warm air disappeared like a coin dropped in a well. When I drew breath again, it brought back the smell of damp wood and old glue, like the inside of my own house. My mouth tasted metallic. I put the bark back in place and the smell faded. I had to sit on the steps to steady myself. I thought of ice fishermen feeding their lines through holes that looked innocent on the surface. I thought of how you can keep a thing alive and hidden if you are careful with air and timing and the patience to return. I did not speak the girl's name out loud. I texted my neighbor to ask if he had seen anyone in the alley last night. He wrote, storm had him sleeping hard all night like a rock. He added a line about plows coming late again, said the storm had crews stretched thin. Inside, I turned up the thermostat until the vents rattled. The furnace's smell rose at first, that hot dust smell that belongs to high-walled winters and closed houses. I stood over the kitchen vent and heard, if I am honest, nothing human. But when I opened the basement door, a thread of cold reached up from the seam and touched my wrist as if to remind me of the hole in the snow. I took a flashlight and went down the stairs. The cement floor held my boot prints from last week where I had stacked jars. The floor felt dry under leather. No melt had seeped under the bulkhead. The inner door was still latched. I pressed my ear to it as I had before and listened until my knees hurt. After a long stretch, a knock answered again, 2 weak knocks this time, a beat apart. I recorded it. The recording heard them too. On the way back up, the light caught something tucked under the bottom step. A second strip of orange plastic. Not torn, but cut clean through holes where a tie had run. When I wiped a thumb across it, a smear of ice gave up the faint smell of gun oil. I do not know why oil holds a scent that long, only that I smelled it and recognized it from borrowed tools and the times I had watched my neighbor clean a thing until it gleamed. Was the angel a marker for air, or for the hunter who returns to check the line? I needed to prove the nights to myself. I dusted flour across the mat inside the back door and tied a string from the knob to a chair, a childish test. Before bed, I wiped the doorbell camera and set an alert on my phone for motion. The weather app said the snow would thicken after midnight. The town's site said plows would push through before dawn. I left the kitchen light on, the living room lamp off. I placed the orange strips on the table and sat in the dim, feeling the house settle around me. Sometime after midnight, my phone hummed. The alert triggered. The doorbell camera showed only white. A curtain of flakes filled the lens in a way that made distance vanish. I went to the window and lifted the corner of the blind. The yard held another angel, smaller, tucked close to the bulkhead. I did not see anyone. I did not hear more than the furnace and the small noises houses make when they cool. When I opened the back door a crack to look for prints, the string held steady. The flyover lay unbroken. The cold slipped under my shirt and made me fold my arms in. I could see the alley past the fence, and I watched. In the diffused streetlight, someone moved near the far post, fast and low, brushing the snow with a bundle of pine like a broom. He erased the prints with long, practiced strokes, walking backward so he did not step where he had stepped before. He wore no headlamp. He carried his light in his head. That is how it looked, the way his body knew where to move. He reached the corner where my fence met his and paused to inspect a line of impressions, not quite boot prints, but a rounded pattern like overshoes leave. He bent and tamped them flat with the side of his palm. The man wore a jacket with a dark hood, no bright color to catch the eye. He turned his head once as if sensing attention and then set the pine aside and disappeared on his own path, a path that did not cross itself, toward the side gate of the house next door. When he passed under his motion light, it did not turn on. Some part of me had always known he unscrewed the bulbs when storms came, said they burned out quickly in the cold. When I stepped into the yard at dawn, I found a single clear boot print near the bulkhead where the sweep marks had not reached. The tread matched mine. At first, I thought the imprint belonged to me, a careless step I had made without noticing. In my kitchen, I took off one boot and checked it against the photo on my phone. The pattern matched. I tasted panic like penny water. Had I walked out in my sleep? The flyer at the mat remained undisturbed. The string still tied my door to the chair. The latch still held. I followed the print to the alley and saw where a second, faint pattern had nearly overlapped it, the same tread, slightly smaller, pressed just enough to read. I am not a detective. I am a woman who shovels her own path and sets her own locks and stares out windows when the town goes quiet. But I recognized an overlay when I saw one. Someone had borrowed a pattern to write a story in my snow, if my boot marks were not mine, whose feet learned my treads well enough to wear my yard like a mask. I brought a hammer and a pry bar to the bulkhead at dusk. The sky held that sodium amber stain the street lamps make when the snow thickens again. I set the tools on the step where I could reach them and put my ear to the seam one more time. The wood was colder than the night air, and through it I heard rough breath, not words. It rasped once, then waited, then rasped again. My mouth made a sound before my mind did. I spoke, introducing myself to the door, as strange as that is. I said I would open it. I said I would call for help. My voice sounded too loud, as if it had to displace something tight in the space beyond. I pried the hasp. It gave more easily than it should have, as if it had been closed gently and not hammered into place. The inner latch took more work. When it opened, something brushed my fingers from the inside, not a hand, but a string threaded through a drilled hole in the bottom corner of the door. a string tied to a small twist of birch bark that I knew from the angel outside. I eased the door a few inches. The smell found me immediately: damp wood, stored potatoes, a sigh or trace of old glue, breath caught in a small room. Cold reached out and wrapped my forearms and slid into my sleeves. I saw a shape then in the stairwell below, a bundled form with a scarf over the face, eyes bright in a headlamp's pale glow. "Please," she whispered. "He comes back to check." He said, "Hold still." He said, "Breathe quiet." Her lips looked cracked. Her voice was a thread. I pulled the door wider, and the headlamp slid to the side and showed me a line of holes drilled along the joist near the bulkhead, each plugged with bark, an air chain that corresponded to the small openings under the angels' heads. I do not know how long I stood like that, torn between hauling her up and slamming the door to keep the pattern from repeating. My neighbor's snowblower roared to life 2 houses over, the sound felt rather than heard, a vibration like a hive through the packed snow. I said the girl's name then. She nodded. Her hands were bound in front of her. The rope looked like the braided, kind hunters used to drag a weight in winter. I called for help. The line rang long and answered late, the storm slowing response. I put my hand on her shoulder and felt the damp heat of a body that had been trapped too long, warmer than the air. I brought a blanket that smelled like the cedar chest it came from. She closed her eyes when I tucked it around her. The haze of her breath rose in thin white threads. I stayed at the door and listened beyond the house sounds. The night seemed to lean toward the alley. The angel outside was not a prank. The angel marked where she breathed, where he measured her breath for return. If he had fed her air, what else had he planned to feed upon? Storms give hunters cover. I knew this now in my skin. The doorbell camera blinded under falling flakes. My motion light kept its warm head turned to the siding. The plows cut the alley once and left 2 walls that muffled footfalls and set a single channel for retreat. People went to bed early during storms. They turned thermostats down. Furnaces hummed and washed out smaller noise. In the dark before dawn, the street's sodium lamps haloed the air and made it look thicker than it was. That Ior has a pocket in it, a place where ordinary sight does not quite reach and ordinary habits make a gap. I watched the neighbor's house across the fence. I noted which lights he turned on and which stayed dark. I saw him carry a bundle of pine boughs to the mudroom and set them near the door. It is not illegal to keep a broom of pine by your boots. It is not even unusual after a storm. I watched him stretch a clear line from his second-story window to the back fence post at midday, threading it under the lip of a shutter. The line whispered in the wind at night like a thread pulled through cloth. I phoned the girl's mother and told her where to meet me. I brought the girl hot broth in a jar with a towel wrapped around it. The jar warmed my hands through the cloth. The smell of the broth, chicken and onion and pepper, lifted into the cold and hung there a second before the air took it apart. The girl drank slow, both hands on the glass. She whispered that he had spoken to her like game, asking about her lungs, explaining the way to take shallow breaths to conserve warmth, the way to hold still to keep heat. Her eyes carried a distant, animal alertness. She had learned the ire of his returns by the taste of the air that came through the holes. I saw the window again in my mind where the line left the shutter. The first angel had not required footsteps. Not if you used a shaped frame and a rope and the patience to lower and lift. The second and third had come with drag marks because he had moved the object he called prey. The strip of orange in my pocket warmed under my hand. I set the girl's empty jar on the step. Near dawn, when the town held its breath before engines started and voices rose, the bell I had tied to the bulkhead latch rang once. A small sound, bright and undeniable. The ring told me what the camera could not through white. Someone had touched the place they wanted kept. I turned off my kitchen light to reduce glare. I went to the upstairs window with the blind already raised. He came low and careful across the alley, the pine in his hands. He erased where he stepped when he could. Where he could not, he set his foot inside an earlier step. He did not cross his own path. He moved to the angel and tamped the edges with the back of his palm as if tucking a child in bed. He checked the birch bark plug and pressed it lightly, testing the way a person tests a lid. He laid the pine aside and bent to study something near my steps. I recognized the jacket then, worn at the elbows, the small stitched patch near the shoulder. I had seen it walk firewood between stacks. I had seen it bend at the community fair under a pop-up tent. The neighbor kept his head down as if a camera might meet his eyes. When he turned, I saw how empty his face looked of apology. He had a task to finish and boots to scrub and prints to clean. His hands shook pine needles like rain. What do you call a man who builds a season and then hunts inside your yard when your lights sleep? I called out his name. The window carried my voice down and threw it into the alley where it sounded like someone else's voice. He froze. The pine bough hung in his hand, a green sweep about to erase the last clues he had not already swept. He did not run. He looked up and squinted toward me, mouth set, like a man peering at a distant tree line to decide if a shape is worth the shot. I came down with my boots laced and the orange strip in one hand. My other hand held my phone, call already open to the line that sends help. He lifted the bough and let it fall. Pine's scent lifted. I could see it then, how he had misread his window. The plow had passed once and would pass again after sunrise. The snow was still falling, but thinner. The camera lens I had wiped every hour showed more seen than white. My light bulbs no longer sat in their sockets loose. The bell on the latch had given away the touch. The quiet hour had shortened by what I had done and by what he had not anticipated. "Do not," I said, "do not touch my door." He nodded once like a man not used to being told anything, weighed it, and stepped anyway. He lifted his boot to erase the print by the step where a smaller version of my tread had layered over a larger one. He was cleaning the story while it was still being told. The girl inside made no sound. The house seemed to hold the sound for her. The bell quivered and went still. The first siren was not loud. The storm and the way sound moves over snow made it come and go like a far bird. He swore under his breath. It sounded like a word, but I do not repeat it. He set the pine against the fence and held his hands out, palms up, as if he could show me nothing was there. His gloves were clean. That felt like the most damning detail, the clean gloves of a man who had brushed away the proof of his own hands. On the step, a third strip of orange had fallen from the cuff of his jacket. I picked it up and turned it so the side with the black marks faced the snow. The plastic warmed quickly against my palm. He saw the strip, and his mouth closed in a line that said problem solved or problem postponed. He looked past me to the bulkhead and then back to the alley. If he had a path that never crossed itself, it ended here. The plow came again and the sound drew closer. The neighbor chose. He stepped backward, careful not to add to what he had already erased, careful to place his boots inside his earlier route. He did not run. He did not plead. He did what hunters do when a shot goes wrong and the deer bolts with a wound. He accepted the chase had tipped in the other direction and tried to vanish into the timber line he trusted. The alley gave him only one channel between its walls. The siren reached the house then, and red light moved like heat on low across the yard. The officers came face down into the storm, wide-legged for balance. One slipped and swore and kept going. They found him at the side gate brushing snow from hinges like a handyman caught at his job. The pine bough leaned there where he had set it. When they cuffed him, he stared at the fence, not at me. His eyes were the flat color of creek ice. Downstairs, the girl's breath warmed the bulkhead opening when we lifted the door fully. The damp smell of rope and wood glue and old paint lifted and then diluted in the cold. Her hands shook when we cut the ties. Her skin under the scarf felt too cold and too warm in turns, that frightening mix of surface chill and hoarded heat. In her pocket, there was a tiny bundle of birch bark plugs she had kept like talismans, each shaped to the holes drilled along the joist. She pushed them into my palm one by one like coins for passage. She said his name. It was the name I had called into the alley. They put her in the back seat of the warm car and wrapped a foil blanket that made its own crinkle sounds. I walked back to my step alone. The angel in the yard had softened until it looked like a body sinking through. Wind roughed its edges and then smoothed them again. On the porch rail, a smear of orange caught the weak light. Plastic scraped across wood where his sleeve had brushed. His orange tag glowed in my cellar.